So we're covering Daniel chapter 2 tonight. Daniel chapter 2 is one of the longer chapters in the book of Daniel. And so I would like, let's see here, we want 6 readers tonight. So who would be willing to take verses 1 through 11? Okay, 1 through 11, verses 12 through 16. Okay, Betty, right? Okay, Betty has 12 through 16. Rick, why don't you take verses 17 through 23? Verses 24 through 35. Who would be willing to take that? Okay, Jean up here. Verses 36 to 45. 36 to 45, Doug. And then verses 46 through 49. I've got 49 verses to read. 46 through 49, who has it? Okay, Judy has it. All right, so I hope we're all there. Daniel chapter 2, starting with verse 1. Read nice and loud, those people are reading tonight.
Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell your servant the dreams, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean.
Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Because of this, the king became indignant and was very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he should give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation of the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter.
That he would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning the secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he chief... Sorry?
Oh, go ahead, Rick.
And he changes the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter.
Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. And said thus to him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon, bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found a man among the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said unto Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known unto me the dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king, and said, The secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and make it known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall happen, what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, which should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known unto thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom, that I might have more than any living, but that for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart.
Why don't you read through verse 35?
Oh, 35, sorry. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, and his breasts and arms of silver, his bellies and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image on its feet, that were made of iron and clay, and brake them into pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken into pieces together, and became as the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth.
This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art the king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for inasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, and there shall be in it of the strength of iron, forasmuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure.
Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth, it is your God, that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king.
Okay, thank you for reading God's Word. What an amazing story, huh? And let's get to our outline and discuss the main issues of what we have read. First point, as we will do each night, we want to briefly review the structure of the chapter. It's divided into 6 categories that you read. In verses 1 through 11, we have Nebuchadnezzar disturbed by a dream. In verses 12 through 16, we have execution of wise men commanded, and then what? Countermanded. In verses 17 through 23, Daniel receives knowledge of the dream and then expresses his gratitude. By the way, let me pause there and say, well, let me ask you a question. In your life, has God done great things for you? Has God cared for you? Yeah. And when God does something for us, what should be our first response? To express gratitude and to give thanks and praise. As I have considered things in my life, I know that there have been times when I did not give God the proper gratitude and praise for what He has done. And I believe that when we do not give God the proper praise and gratitude, that then we have kind of the tendency of taking those things to ourselves, or possibly giving it to someone else. And, that is something that leads us in the wrong direction. I always want to give God the praise and the honor and the thanksgiving for all the blessings that I have in life. That will keep, I think that will keep our lives in proper perspective. We will remember who He is, and we'll understand and realize more who we are and how much we need Him. Then in verses 24 through 35, we see that Daniel communicates the dream to the king. In verses 36 through 45, Daniel then interprets the dream. And then 46 through 49, those last few verses, we see King Nebuchadnezzar acknowledging God's greatness. And also rewards Daniel and his 3 friends for their faithfulness to their God. So, that's the structure. Let's go to point number 2. Daniel 2 sends a message loud and clear. How many times have you read Daniel 2? I don't know how many times I've read Daniel 2. I've been reading it for a long time, but every time I'm amazed, aren't you? I believe God is sending a message that is loud and clear. God loves man so much that He will go through what kind of means? Extraordinary means. Extraordinary means. I would consider this an extraordinary means. But it was something that King Nebuchadnezzar and probably any other king could relate to. Because back in those days, we're talking about around 600 years before the time of Christ, kings used dreams as they believed that their dreams were some kind of message that they were to then follow in order to become great kings. A lot of these kings consider themselves as gods. And so when they received a dream, they considered that a message from the gods. And so here is God, who's of course the only God. He's the ruler of the universe. And you see God sitting on the throne saying, you know what? Nebuchadnezzar has taken my boys captivity. My boys have been faithful to me. So the king thinks that, he and his little so-called gods are the tops. So we're going to send a message. And I can see God smiling on his throne saying, I'm going to use what those earthly kings kind of think on a little bit. And so God kind of steps out of the box, so to speak. He uses extraordinary means to reach people on planet Earth. And I'm grateful for that, aren't you? So let's complete the sentence there. God loves man so much, he will go to extraordinary means to reach how many? Well, should we put in the blank there? All, or everyone. This chapter tells how the Lord of the universe reached a pagan earthly ruler. And it proclaims to everyone on earth that God exists and rules over all. Yes, Rick.
The thing I love about this chapter is how confident Daniel is when he communicates with the king. Even though he's making this death decree and everything, he's just superbly confident in the way he addresses the king.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Daniel has been taught the leading of God amongst his people. And so question, does Daniel know the story of God's call to Abram out of the land of Mesopotamia to the promised land? Yeah. Does Daniel know how God took care of Abraham in his travels? Yeah, he's learned that from knee-high to a grasshopper. Does Daniel know the story of Isaac? Does Daniel know the story of Jacob? Does Daniel know the story of Jacob's 12 sons and the story of Joseph in Egypt and the miraculous leadings of God? Does Daniel know the story of the deliverance, the miraculous deliverance from Egypt and crossing through the Red Sea? I mean, Daniel knows the history of his people. He knows that God rules the universe, and he knows that if God can step down at the Red Sea and cause a wind to open up the pathway and dry out the bottom of the sea so that God's people could get across to the other side and then close the waters on the Egyptian army. I mean, think about that. Only a creator could do that. Can you see God stepping down and blowing and the sea opens up? Only the creator could do that. And so Daniel knows all these stories. And so he could confidently go to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, and say, take me in before the king. Now the king has just given Arioch the order. Destroy how many of the wise men of Babylon? All of them. And now Daniel, who's part of the wise men, remember what was his score that we read about last night? 10 times better. So he's the wisest of the wise. And the king has given a command. And how many times do the soldiers or the guards come back on the king's command?
Never.
Yeah. So Daniel says, Arioch, take me in before the king. And I can imagine Arioch saying something like, oh, boy. That's not a good idea. I can lose my head on that one.
It was already a death decree.
Yeah.
You had to lose it.
And so Daniel, convinces Arioch, you don't have anything to worry about. And so that's confidence, isn't it? Confidence in what God could do. Take me in before the king. I would like to make a request. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to me that all the wise men and the Chaldeans testified that the only person who could do this, it says in verse 11, There's none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh.
Yes.
So they're even acknowledging that,
Yes.
there's a God out there who knows how to do this, but
Yeah, yeah.
we're not in touch with him.
Yeah. And so, let's get to it. Yes.
Verse 25, when I was reading that, it sounded to me like Arioch was completely convinced. I have found a man of the captives of Judah who can tell the king the interpretation.
Yeah, we'll get to the me stuff. Yeah. The highlights in this chapter are phenomenal. You know? Yeah, Betty.
Don't you think that one of the important things is that Nebuchadnezzar chose not to believe them this time?
Okay, explain a little more.
They usually adopted whatever the wise men said.
Yeah.
But he wasn't disposed to do that. He was absolutely adamant that they tell him the dream.
And we believe that he was being honest when he said the thing's gone from me. You know? And so he's asking the wise men who claim to speak for the gods to tell the dream and then give the interpretation.
He gave them absolutely no hint, and that was their
Yeah.
failure.
And he was, I don't believe that he was asking them anything that they didn't claim to already be able to do.
That's right.
You know, he was asking something big from them, but when they were put on the spot, it was time to deliver. What happened?
He recognized their failure.
Yeah, he recognized these guys are a bunch of fakesters and tricksters. So let's catch up to our outline here. Point 3, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream one night, could not remember it. What did he ask his wise men to do? To tell the dream and give the interpretation. What did the wise men say?
Tell us the dream.
Tell us the dream,
We'll interpret.
and we'll interpret it. And then, of course, the king didn't back off. He came right back at him and said, you guys claim to be able to do this, and I'm asking you to give me the dream. That way, then I know that you can what? Then interpret it. And so, why did the king give the command to destroy all the wise men?
Well, they said twice that they couldn't do it.
Yeah, they can't do it. Then the second time, they're saying, you know, you have made a request that no king has ever made to anybody else. So they're kind of putting it back on the king, saying, what you're doing is not appropriate. And you don't tell King Nebuchadnezzar something like that. And then, of course, in his anger, in his fury, he tells the captain of the guards, take these men away and destroy how many of the wise men of Babylon? All of them. Get rid of them all. So, point 4, enter Daniel into the picture and his friends into the situation. And once Daniel is made, he's brought up to speed on what's going on, he makes a request. And let's pause there for a moment. Daniel is brought up to speed on what's going on. That means something. What does that mean? He was not part of the original group of wise men that were brought in before the king the first time. And you think he would have been because he is the one who got the highest score in the history of the postgraduate program at the University of Babylon. You know, these guys blew the scores through the roof. And so the king considered these guys the wisest of the wise. And yet when he gives the call for the wise men to be brought into him, obviously Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, you know, they weren't part of that group. So I got a question for you. Why do you suppose that was the case? This is just something for us to think about. Why do you suppose that was the case? Yeah, Jeff.
Maybe that group was the night shift.
Now, maybe that group was the night shift. I've not thought of it that way, but that could be. And the day shift and the night shift. Yeah,
I've
Joanne.
always figured that when he called these people in, they were soothsayers. They
Yeah,
were
there was a group of them, yeah.
And they weren't godly. And so, but they were used to faking stuff. And so they were a certain little elite group that made up stuff.
Okay,
you know.
yeah. These guys are Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were kind of the intellectual scholarly group. The soothsayers, they were just off on a bunch of weird
Yeah.
magical type stuff. The astrologers, who were the astrologers? These were the guys that studied the heavens. They were not astronomers. Astronomy, I believe, is the true science of looking at the stellar heavens. The astrologers believed that you could look at the heavens and they could tell you your future. Yeah, Rick.
And some of those guys could have been hangers-on and yes men, but they were always there, to like kind of kiss up,
Yeah.
just always around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Daniel and his three friends had to be informed. When Arioch came to them to take them away, did Daniel and his three friends know what was up?
No.
In the story, you get the picture. They don't know what's going on. And so obviously they weren't part of that group. And the story doesn't tell us why on that. But as you follow through the storyline of the book of Daniel, what you have set up is Daniel and his three friends. They're part of the wise men, but they're not part of the in group. All right? Yeah.
They were quite young still.
Yeah, they were still quite young.
They were still quite young, so they didn't have the seniority, and
Yeah.
the older people probably were holding on to their power and not promoting the younger people much.
Yeah. And so you remember at the beginning of the chapter, what year is this? In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So we believe this is probably Daniel and his three friends had been in Babylon at this time. They've completed 3 years of service, and this is probably in the 4th year. So it's in the 4th year of Daniel and his three friends' captivity. They've been in Babylon now. They're in their 4th year. That's the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar when this happened. So they're still young men. Early 20s at the oldest. And they weren't part of the in group. But something very fun that you can watch, and we'll get to it by the time we get to the end of the series.
I don't think they were in the astrologer. They weren't in that type of business.
Yeah.
No.
What they was in was a government business. They weren't for.
They were in the royal service of the king.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they served a true God of heaven. And yet they're part of this group of wise men. But they are not the fakesters and the tricksters, So they're not part of the in group. And as you go through the book of Daniel, at every important stage where the wise men are called to do something, the wise men fail. But then Daniel and his three friends step forward, and they deliver the goods. And then when the Medo-Persian Empire takes over, you see the ruling aristocracy and the wise men being brought to a challenge, and they fail. And then Daniel steps forward, and what does he do? He delivers the goods. Then at the fall of Babylon, Belshazzar calls the wise men in. Could the wise men deliver the information with the handwriting on the wall? No. What do? Call Daniel in. And does he deliver the goods? He delivers the goods. And then when you get to the end of the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 12, there's another group of wise men wise ones that are mentioned. That's not Daniel and his three friends, because they're going to be off the scene. But this is the point. You have wise men all through the book of Daniel. You have the wise men of Babylon and Medo-Persia, and you have the wise men of God. And every single solitary time when there's an issue and a challenge, the wise men are supposed to deliver, and they all fail except for God's wise men. And so that's kind of the overall picture. And so here, Daniel and his friends are not part of that, that in-group that goes in at the beginning. And we don't know all the dynamics behind that when you look at the full book of Daniel. I have a hunch, as these wise men that were brought in before the king didn't want Daniel and his buddies to be with that group. The king is asking for wisdom. They don't know yet what the situation is, but they know that when the king asks, they give the information, and then they are rewarded by the king. And so they're, in my opinion, trying to take all the glory and leave these young upstarts from Judah. They're outsiders. What was that? Don't tell them. Yeah, don't tell them. Now, that's what I believe was going on behind the scenes. But let's get to the point. Point 4, Daniel and his friends are brought into the situation. What did Daniel request? He doesn't tell anybody to do anything, but he kindly requests. And what's the request? Time. So he goes in before the king, and he says, King, I wasn't, with the original group there. You gave time for them to, respond. And King, I just need time to communicate with God. And will you grant me that time? And the king was a reasonable man. And what did the king do? He granted the time. You could almost see the king sitting on his throne and say, okay, Daniel, you pray to your God tonight, and we'll see you in the morning. And Daniel is willing to say, yep, that's good enough. I'll be back. That takes courage, doesn't it?
Yes,
It takes faith.
Yeah.
And did Daniel believe that God knew the dream that was given to the king? Yeah, Daniel believed that. All he had to do was pray. And he believed that God could give the dream and the interpretation. I have a hunch that he also believed that if God chose not to do it, he was still going to trust in God, even though his life would then be on the line. And Tuesday night, we'll read another story in Daniel chapter 3 that tells us exactly that. So let's go to point 5, the next day before the king. What did Arioch do? Gene has alluded to it. Daniel goes to Arioch, take me in before the king. I've got the goods. And so they go in before the king. What did Arioch do?
Took credit for the whole thing.
Yeah. What did the text there say? I have found a man. Question. Did Arioch find a man? No. It wasn't a situation where Arioch was the one taking the initiative and finding anything. It was Daniel going to Arioch in the first place saying, Arioch, will you take me in before the king? And then he comes back the next day saying, Arioch, take me before the king. I've got the goods now. And so Arioch goes in, and you could almost see, I kind of picture this in my mind. They go into the courtroom, all the courtiers are there and everything. Arioch is, what position does he hold?
Military.
Yeah, he's head of the military. He's the top general. He's captain of the king's guard. And so he has this high position. So he goes marching in. Daniel's following him. They get before the king's throne. And Arioch says, O king, live forever. I have found a man.
But Arioch must have really been convinced. Because otherwise, if he takes him in and says, I found this man, and Daniel doesn't have the goods, then his head's gonna come off too.
So most likely, Arioch knew about these 4 young upstarts from Judah and know that they scored well on the final test. They're part of the royal service. Arioch's part of the king's guard. So there was probably around a year's time between the 3-year graduation and the time when the king has his dream. So he's probably familiar with that a little bit. And Daniel comes back the next morning, and the text doesn't say exactly what Daniel told Arioch, but you get the picture that Arioch was convinced. Okay, let's go. Yeah.
But it says back in Daniel 1:17 that Daniel was given an understanding of
Yes.
all visions and dreams,
Yeah.
so they knew that he had the ability,
Yeah.
which is probably why Arioch went to him in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And so Arioch, he knows that Daniel has the goods. And so, in a nutshell, when Arioch says, King, you're not going to believe this, but I've done it again. I'm the captain of your guards, and I have found a man. So what was he doing there when he said that?
Trying to take credit for it.
Yeah, he was what?
Glorifying himself.
Yeah, glorifying himself.
Looking for a promotion.
Yeah, maybe looking for a promotion.
Daniel didn't go in there and say, I'm the man.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. Yeah, Jeff.
Given the temperament of the king, I don't really believe him.
Yeah, and also,
Okay.
We'll give him some leeway.
Give him some leeway.
he had not followed out the king's direct order to kill all those people. So he had better make himself look good so that maybe the king would forget that he was disobedient.
Well, yeah, so Arioch, he brings Daniel in the first time, and the king grants the request. So he's off the hook. Arioch's off the hook at that point. He is putting his life on the line when he goes in the first time, because the king gave the command, you destroy the wise men. So Arioch was gathering the wise men up. That included who? Daniel and his 3 friends.
They were sharpening his
And Daniel in wisdom, and I believe very courteously, requested time. Arioch, will you take me before the king? I'll request time to speak with God. And Arioch was willing to do that. At that point, he was putting his life on the line. The king granted the permission. At that point, Arioch is kind of off the hook, isn't he? And then the next morning, Arioch takes Daniel back into the king's court. And, yeah, so in a nutshell, Arioch, he is, I put it this way, he's wanting a piece of the pie. You know? He's wanting a cut of the cake. Because he knows that Daniel's going to deliver, and when the king sees people deliver, the king gives his rewards. And so Arioch is in it, isn't he? And so that's what Arioch does. He says, I'm the man. I have found man. So next question, what did Daniel do? The opposite of Arioch, what did Daniel do? Yes.
The first thing Daniel did was to give the soothsayers, Chaldeans, and the rest of them an out by agreeing with them
Yeah.
that he couldn't do it, that only God could do it, which is exactly what they had said
Yeah.
previously.
Yeah. They had said, King, your request is not appropriate because only the gods can do that. Now the king, his take is, when you study a little bit of Babylonian history, those wise men, these Chaldeans, they claim to be able to communicate with the gods. You know? So yeah, it's on the resume. You know, and so the king was, from his perspective, he's saying, okay, so that this stuff only comes from the gods. You communicate with the gods, and they'll give you the information. You know? And of course, they knew they were in trouble, and they said we can't do it. And they were, at that point, you're right, they were telling the truth. They couldn't. And Daniel, the first thing he says, he agrees with the wise men. King, You know, all the Chaldeans, these soothsayers, the astrologers, they can't do it. The wise men can't do it. And Daniel, even though he wasn't part of the in crowd there, Frank, Daniel is kind of putting himself in that category and saying, King, you dreamed a dream, you want to know the dream, you want to know the interpretation. I'm standing here before you, and I'm just letting you know, us wise men, we can't do it. But then what was the next thing that... So that's opposite of what Arioch has said. Arioch is coming in saying, giving himself his Amway pat on the back. Babylonian Amway pat on the back. I have found a man. So the man steps forward, and the king, is on the edge of his seat, ready to hear, and Daniel says, we can't do it. So then what's the next thing that Daniel says?
There's a God.
Yeah.
But
But there is a God in heaven. And can you see that young man, early 20s, standing before the king, all the courtiers, anybody is probably there. Probably the other wise men were there, hoping and praying this young guy comes through. And can you see him standing there in all humility and courage and pointing his finger towards heaven, saying, King, man can't do it, but there's a God in heaven. And the God in heaven is a revealer of secrets. And at that point, I believe that the mind and the heart of Nebuchadnezzar was touched. Because he sees, here's a young man, barely out of his teen years, and he's not doing what my captain... Do you think the king knew what Arioch was doing?
Sure.
Yeah, he was a sharp king. He wasn't king because he was stupid, So he sees through this, and now he sees this young man stepping forward and saying, King, your other wise men can't do it, and neither can I. But I'm going to tell you about the one who can.
Do you think that when Arioch was killing the wise men, did he start with the youngest men? Or in other words, were there some of the wise men that had been slaughtered already?
I don't think anybody was killed to this point.
Okay,
Yeah.
so he started...
Because Arioch is in the process of gathering the wise men up when he runs into Daniel. And Daniel makes the request of him, take me in before the king. And the king gives the time, so nobody is slain yet. And so, let's move on here.
Pastor Mike,
Yes.
the king and the wise men were used to this scenario. Oh, king, you had a dream. Fine, tell us what the dream is. We'll tell you the interpretation. And so that whole process, that standard operating procedure, didn't work in this way.
Yeah.
And so the king saw through, and I'm assuming something clicked along with what happened with Daniel. They thought, well, these aren't reliable people, that they want to benefit themselves.
Quick question, what can we learn from the setting of what Arioch did and what Daniel did? What can we learn from that?
All the glory to God.
Yes. Arioch was hoping to get a piece of the pie. He's going to get his take. Daniel is there to glory.
And to say that it's not to my anything.
Yes.
This is not my doing.
So today we live in the year of our Lord 2019, living in the 21st century. When God does things for you, what do you do? Do you say, I have found a man? Or do you say, O king, the wise men can't do it, but there's a God in heaven? I want to be in the second category, don't you? God has the only reason why you and I are here tonight is because of God's blessing and leading in His life, in your lives. I know that's true for me. And so when God does something good, let's be sure and give him glory. Hmm? Yeah, Rick.
Just a quick comment. I think that God, being as thorough as he is, I think there's probably a reason that Nebuchadnezzar just couldn't quite remember what the dream was about.
Yeah, God's in control of it all.
Yeah.
So, let's get to the main point here now. Point 6, the dream. The king dreamed of a great what? Image. And the head of that image was made of gold. The chest and arms were made of silver. The belly and thighs, brass. The legs, made of iron. The feet, yeah, partly iron and partly clay. And then the king saw a stone come flying through the air. What did the stone do? Yeah, the stone hit the image at the feet and knocked the image over, and the image was crushed. And then what did the stone do?
It grew, filled the whole.
Yeah, it grew into a great mountain that filled the whole earth. And so that was the dream. That was what we call in the scholarly world, they call it the dream proper. This great image stood before the king in his dream, head of gold, arms and chest of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, the feet part of iron, part of clay. Then the stone comes, crushes the statue with all the different metals. The wind comes along, blows it away, and the stone grows to a great mountain and fills the earth. So the interpretation. What is the key to the interpretation? Daniel says to the king, "You, O king, are what?"
The head of gold.
The head of gold. So under the head there, that represents King Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, the kingdom of Babylon. And if you want the dates on that, history tells us that Babylon ruled the world from 605 BC to 539 BC. 605 to 539. The chest and arms then represent the next kingdom that defeated Babylon. And you can read about, in Daniel chapter 5, you read about Belshazzar's party and the handwriting on the wall. And Babylon came to an end that night. And what kingdom conquered Babylon?
Persia.
Yeah, the Bible tells us the combined armies of the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon. History agrees. And so the Medo-Persian Empire is the chest and arms. And they ruled from 539 BC, when they conquered Babylon, to 331. Some historians place it at 332. I think most historians place it at 331. And then you go down to the next kingdom, and you can read about that, by the way, in Daniel chapter 8. We will study it. What kingdom ended up conquering the combined Medes and Persians?
Greece.
Yeah, Greece. And you can read about that in your history books. Greece, with their first king, Alexander the Great, Greece ruled from 331 to 168 BC. And then, as you move on into New Testament times, during the days of Jesus, there was a kingdom that ruled the world at that time. What kingdom does the Bible say ruled at that time? The kingdom of Rome. And history tells us that Rome defeated the Greek armies in the year 168 BC. And Rome then ruled from 168 BC, 168 years before the time of Christ, to 476 AD. So Rome was the fourth worldwide power, and of course ruled the longest. And they were represented by the legs of iron. And I remember in high school reading a book on the history of Rome, and The metaphor of Rome with iron is still in our history books. They call it the Iron Monarchy of Rome. Taken from Daniel chapter 2, taken from the Bible. And then the feet are partly iron and partly clay. What does that represent?
The Roman Church and the rest of it.
Yeah, in the 5th century AD, Rome loses its power, but it doesn't lose its power by another empire coming in and taking over the world, but it disintegrates from within. And history tells us that Rome was divided into what they call the barbarian tribes, and how many of them were there that ended up dividing up the then world? There were 10. So just as the feet are divided into 10 toes, the kingdom of Rome was divided into 10. But it would be partly strong and partly weak. That is, part iron and part what? Clay. And in the interpretation, do the iron and the clay cleave together? No. In other words, after that, one world power would never rule the whole world again. After the 4 worldwide kingdoms, that 4th one would disintegrate from within, be divided up. And then in the days of those kings, in the days where the world is ruled by many nations, the stone would come, which represents God's kingdom. But back with the partly strong and partly weak, the clay and the iron, it is said that just as those don't cleave together, neither will these kingdoms cleave together to make one nation to rule the world. Let me share with you a few names, a little bit of history here. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, have there been men and powers that have tried to put it all together?
Yes.
Yes. Charlemagne tried, and was Charlemagne successful? No. After Charlemagne, there was Charles V of Spain. Was Charles V successful in bringing the nations together to rule the world? No. After Charles V was Louis XIV. Was Louis XIV successful? No. After Louis XIV was, I think I heard somebody mention it, Napoleon. Napoleon tried to rule the world. Was he successful? No, he lost it at the Battle of Waterloo. After Napoleon, there was Kaiser Wilhelm in World War I. Was Kaiser Wilhelm successful? No. After Kaiser Wilhelm was who? Adolf Hitler in World War II. Was Adolf Hitler successful? No. Do you know why none of these men were successful?
God said so.
Because God said so. God told Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar 600 years before the time of Christ, about 2,700 years ago. This is the way history is going to unfold. And this is the way it's going to be to the very end. And history, guess what? Has lived up to everything that God showed to Nebuchadnezzar and showed to Daniel, and also the interpretation. Yes?
Part of the verse refers to they tried to mingle with the blood.
Yes.
They're back in...
Yeah, blood ties through marriage.
Yeah, through marriage. The other thing is some of these conquerors heard about these Bible prophecies.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
and they didn't like it, but
Yeah.
they heard it.
When you read some of the writings of Hitler, Hitler knew about Daniel too. And so did, who was it? I think Napoleon. Yeah. I'm sorry, I forgot your first name.
It's okay. I have a question on this though, because in my Bible it says, as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men. Now why is it spelled out like that? It's like there's a different race mingling with the seed of men, and if you go all the way back to Genesis, there will be enmity between your seed and her seed, and then if you go a little bit further in Genesis, it also talks about when the sons of God came down and married into the daughters of men. These things, I have questions.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because it really doesn't sound like it's too, I mean, it really does sound like it's two separate, not races as we think of races, but heavenly versus earthly.
Yeah, my version it says, whereas, so you were reading verse 43, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. That they here,
Yeah, who's they?
yeah, that's the key. So, in the context of the dream, who would the they be? Because the previous things that are being talked about are the 4 worldwide kingdoms. You know, the first kingdom, which is the head of gold, that's Babylon. The second kingdom, Medo-Persia. The next kingdom, Greece. The next kingdom, Rome.
Which
And then after that, it's not another kingdom.
Rome has to be there, but it's the Church of Rome, and not the.
Well, yeah, we'll get to, here we don't have, I don't think we have a description of the Church of Rome. We just have the destruction of Rome, the fall, what historians call the fall of the Roman Empire. So,
Iron, still mixing with, not mixing with clay.
Yeah,
So it's a
yeah, the
fact-
Roman influence is still going through, isn't it? But it's not going to be pure iron anymore. Yeah. So I believe that they here is just simply the men and rulers who are going to try to rule the world. They are not going to be able to do that anymore. That's my take on it.
So it's not necessarily.
And how it connects with the other places where it talks about seed is not relevant.
Well, these different nations and powers after the fall of the Roman Empire, they tried to get it together, and they tried to do it through blood ties, through seed.
Yeah, the kings and queens would be
through
marrying
marriage.
each other.
Yeah, through marriage.
On
It
modern
was tried
marriages, a lot of-
time and time again, and it didn't work. And I believe the reason why is because, I think I like Jeff's answer, God said, we're not going to have it that way anymore. Yeah, Rick.
We've got 2 stages of clay too, because at one point we're talking about hard ceramic clay, and there was also talking about miry clay before it's fired.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much significance to it.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, Jeff.
On mine, in verse 43, it says, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. They would try to get it together, and it wouldn't work.
It's still not making Brexit thing.
Yeah, and it's still not, bring it up to date. It's still not working with the Brexit thing going on. Yeah. Or the United Nations. You know,
Or NATO.
or NATO. Yeah, there's lots of ways we were trying to get it together, but the reality is it's going to remain the iron and the clay until the stone comes. And in the interpretation, what does the stone represent? Yeah, the second coming of Christ, the setting up of God's kingdom on earth. Who, at that point, how many of the nations of the world are done away with? All of them. And God sets up his kingdom with the faithful who have accepted his plan of redemption. Point 8, Nebuchadnezzar attacked and destroyed God's holy city and temple. But now the king recognizes something. What does the king recognize?
God of heaven.
Yeah, the God of heaven, who lives in the temple and the new city, the new Jerusalem in heaven. He's the one who is the God of gods and Lord of kings. And he rules for, this God rules forever. So the king in chapter 1 thinks that he has, well, I think we talked last night about some of the prophecies of Jeremiah. God had it all under control. He told it to Jeremiah. God would use Nebuchadnezzar in a special way. But at the time, did Nebuchadnezzar know how God was going to use him? No. But did he begin to find out when God gave him this dream that we have studied here in Daniel 2? He began to find out. And after this young man has humbly stood before him, and can you imagine what the king probably thought when this young man said, King, you were lying down in your bed the other night, and you were thinking about the future. And at that point, the king's probably thinking, oh yeah, that is what I was thinking about. And the king, you saw this dream, and it was an image that had a head of gold. And then he went right down through it. Can you imagine what the king was thinking at that moment?
That's it.
You know, he said, wait a second, that's it. You know, and he's looking at this young man standing before him that has just said, we can't do it, but there's a God in heaven. And the king, I can imagine the king thinking, who is this young man? How can he do that? There's only one way. And when Daniel got done, the king, what did the king do?
He acknowledged the God.
Got down on his knees and worshipped that young man. Now, kings don't do that, do they?
Not Nebuchadnezzar in particular.
Yeah. What an amazing picture. Yeah, he didn't bow down before Arioch, who was trying to grab the goods. He is bowing down to this young man who is standing there in all humility and in all courage, lifting up the God of creation, lifting up the God of heaven, pointing Nebuchadnezzar, the king that ruled the world at that time, pointing that king to the true God. And that king began, I would like to put it this way, the king began his journey to be born again. Yeah. What a wonderful story. And according to our clock, we have gone over about 10 minutes over. Any last questions or comments on what we studied tonight? Yeah, Jeff.
It's a thought on Daniel in chapter 1, thinking about Daniel being faithful in the seemingly small things, and then God using and trusting him to be faithful and to use him as an instrument in the large things.
Yeah. Good point. Faithful in the smaller things. God knew that, well, you know what, if I can trust you, you've been faithful in this duty, I can trust you with the next one. Yeah.
And Daniel 2 is used as a chapter to show people, to demonstrate, that God plans the future and executes the future. So it was used for evangelism. And Nebuchadnezzar was the first one to give that message.
Yes, yes. So, yeah, I was getting, after our comments, we're going to have prayer. And any other comments, because I have one more comment to make. Any other questions or comments? All right. So, let's get to it. Can God be trusted?
Amen.
And if God can speak to a pagan king, saying this is how history's going to go, and then give it to a young man, and then history follows it to a T, can God be trusted? Does God sit on his throne, and does he rule the universe? Absolutely. Not only that, this God who has created the universe and rules over the universe, is he interested in humanity on planet Earth? Yeah. A pagan king who doesn't even believe in him is thinking about the future. And God says, okay, I'll help you out with your thinking. So can God be trusted? Absolutely. So next question, one more question. Can his word be trusted? Yes. You don't find this stuff in other books. And this book that we call the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, from this chapter, I believe that this book can be trusted. It tells us about a loving God who sent his only begotten Son to show us the love of the Father and to redeem us from sin. It tells how history will unfold, and it tells how Christ is going to come again, and how God is going to set up his kingdom, and how his faithful ones, those who have accepted his plan of redemption, will going to be part of God's plan throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity. I started reading this book when I was 10 years old. Didn't understand it very much back then. I understand it a little bit more now. But I believe there's still a lot more I need to understand. But I trust that God and his word are trustworthy and faithful. enough to lead me and guide me in my life. What about you? All right, let's go ahead and stand together.